Sorry, I was worried about my computer dying, so I had to pause it in a really awkward mid-sentence thing. Anyways, some of these early anthropologists very much stood up for the rights of Native people, but a lot of them were, if not helping colonialism, complicit to the extent that they weren't exactly pushing back on it either. And in some cases, and I would put Fletching in this category, were complicit in different colonial things. And so it's a complex period for anthropology. But one of the things to recognize from sort of a research perspective is that suddenly you go from anthropology that was on really shaky grounds with this kind of armchair anthropology stuff and these grand sweeping conclusions that later turned out to be crap, right? You go from that, like a lot of their whole, oh, these three stages. The problem with that was once you actually started doing fieldwork, you realize that societies aren't like that at all. Societies don't go through predictable stages. You can have two cultures next to each other, Navajo and Hopi, who have totally different traits from each other, and neither is necessarily more advanced. They've both been in the area for centuries. They're equally advanced. They just have gone down different paths. When people started to do real fieldwork, they started to realize that cultures were far, far, far more complex and rich than they realized, and that they could not be boiled down to, for example, whether or not they used certain kinds of pottery. That actual cultures in the field were complex and complicated and had rich philosophies, and people were just as sophisticated as anybody else. So this started to break down some of those early simplistic theories. Once again, travel was reshaping anthropology. Anthropology has always been a discipline rooted in travel. Whether that's travel to the next village over, to a subculture that you find fascinating, or whether that's travel halfway around the world, travel has always been a part of what we do. Which brings up fieldwork today. So I've kind of been defining fieldwork as I go along, and you've probably had a sense of what I mean by it. And if you're an anthropologist or have taken anthropology classes before, you're like, I know what fieldwork is. Shut your darn mouth, Dunstan. But it is useful to know a little bit about fieldwork if you are not familiar with all that. So anthro majors, you can mute me for a few minutes. Everybody else, listen up. So ethnographic fieldwork. First, the word ethnographic means to write about a people. And that gives you a good sense of what we're trying to do when we do fieldwork. We want to get to know the way of life of a community so well that we could write well about it. Now, historically, that would have been coming home and writing a scientific journal article or a monograph for the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was run by the federal government, or writing a book and publishing it. That like Argonauts of the Western Pacific in Malinowski's case. Nowadays, it may be just as likely that the thing you write about a people might be, for example, maybe you're working with an activist group and trying to write about some of their concerns with a sacred site, and so you help write a press release about their concerns about a sacred site, or maybe write a blog post about it, or in a local newspaper about it, or maybe you're working for the federal government as a Park Service person trying to better understand the ways that Tlingit people traditionally use the land that you're stewarding. And so what you're writing is maybe trying to find information that could be written into like a sign, right? The signs that parks have to try to inform the public. So the point is, the writing in this case could mean a lot of things, but the idea is you go and learn about a people, an ethnos, a people, and then you graphy it, that you write it, that you record what you learned. So that's the first part of that word, ethnographic. Fieldwork implies that you go into the field, however we're defining that. That could be places that might seem very exotic, such as Sophie Chow here working in Indonesia, who's done fantastic work on palm oil plantations, work that I require you to read in some of my other classes. Or it could be in such exotic locations as an ice cream shop in Western New York, which is where your professor was doing research on LDS tourists, because it so happens that they don't drink. You don't go down to the local bar to find people. You go down to the local ice cream shop, and everybody heads out there before they head out of town to grab an ice cream cone. And so that's like a great place to interview people. Not exactly as exotic as a palm oil plantation in the middle of Indonesia, but it's still field work, right? It's out with people looking at their cultures as they occur in real time. By the way, if you're wondering who these different people are, going in clockwise order, Sophie Chow, as I mentioned, does awesome work, environmental anthropology work. George Hunt, who was a Tlingit linguist, who worked with Boas closely and didn't really get quite the credit he deserved at the time, but now people have recognized more how deeply he was informing Boas's work and just linguistics in general. Of course, again, my field site in Western New York. Then continuing on, you have, oh gosh, who is that? Oh, dude. Who's that guy? Who's that anthropologist? Huh. Can't believe I don't remember. Whoever you are, Mr. Anthropologist, I apologize. Know that I like your field work enough that I looked you up on Google Images and slapped a picture there, but apparently forgot who I put there. The next one up after that is Paul Stoller, who wrote a really great ethnographic book called Sorcery in Sorcery's Shadow. And then up one more from that is Ruth Behar, who's known for her fieldwork in a variety of different languages or locations, including Cuba, which she has connections with, and has written some really powerful ethnography that tends to be very direct and honest. And so wrote a famous book called The Vulnerable Observer. Anyways, fieldwork is done in many different ways in many different locations, but at its core, it is a way to go and spend time with a group of people to develop what one anthropologist calls gut knowledge, the kind of knowledge you get from being there in person to see what it feels like to be a part of that community. You go and you don't just observe people farming, you go and farm and experience what it's like to do an entire day of backbreaking labor as a horticultural farmer, chopping down trees in a forest to try to do some planting. You go and for me, for example, take part in a protest and, even on the front lines of it and get to feel what that feels like. Does that make you an insider, somebody that's been there for years doing the same work? No. Does it help generate more knowledge? Definitely, right? This kind of gut or experiential knowledge. That's how people learn culture to begin with. That's how little kids learn culture. We immerse them in it and slowly get them to do more things in it. And the idea of fieldwork is essentially you're like a little kid. You travel to a new place where you're not a member of the community. And like a little kid, you get immersed in it and you slowly get more capable. And as you slowly get more capable, we give you more tasks to do. And sometimes by trial and error, and sometimes by actual instruction, we will teach you how to culture. Which brings up the fact that if you want to talk about hosts and guests in tourism, which we often do, anthropologists are sort of the ultimate guests, right? We rely on the generosity of communities that we spend time with. I think most of the time have good intentions. That was not always true. I think it's true nowadays that most anthropologists want to do good work that helps the communities they're staying with. Nonetheless, even though that's the case, we sometimes stick out like sore thumbs. We sometimes don't know how to do things properly because we're not from there. We are travelers. I don't want to say tourists, but we are travelers. We are guests, and the communities we spend time with are host communities that choose to share their life with us. So in a very real way, anthropology, once again, is rooted in travel and this host-guest relationship. Fieldwork can be seen as if we want to think of anthropology as a science, which tends to be how I think of it, you can see fieldwork as a way that you make a space for data collection methods, which we'll talk about a little later, but it's a way that you get into the area where you do interviews and surveys and where people feel comfortable with you so that you can do things like interviews and surveys and get this great thing we call data or information, which to some people sounds dehumanizing, but for me as somebody trained in a scientific background, sounds very humanizing. It's a powerful thing when you don't just make stereotypes about people, but actually try to find out real information about them to tell a story accurately about their life. If you view anthropology more like a humanities, something akin to journalism, something akin to history, then you might say that fieldwork is a way of immersing yourself in a space, developing relationships, and then reflecting on those relationships and on your own sort of experience of this, what we sometimes call experiential immersion in the Leet and Swan reading. And in my opinion, most cultural anthropologists are kind of scientists and kind of humanists, right? They're kind of a mix of both. When you go and do fieldwork, you try to do this kind of objective data collection thing, and that's great. But you also inevitably are touched at a very personal soul or emotional level with these people that are your hosts, as you should be, right? And so there's both things going on. By the way, it is possible to do autoethnographic fieldwork. And in that regard, fieldwork doesn't necessarily always involve travel. You could also, sometimes that may be, so autoethnographic, meaning with your own culture. although even that is complex, right? So for example, when I go and do fieldwork with tourists that I've talked about in New York, I have family connections to New York and then also cultural connections to the tourists themselves. But I still want to, so is that auto-ethnographic? I suppose technically, but I still have to travel to go do it, right? Because to just kind of stay at home and write my own experience, well, I'm weird, right? I might not be very representative of folks, and I want to know about a very specific subset of people that spend a lot of time and money to go visit these historic sites. Um, Similarly, um, so that's an example of autoethnographic, and it's interesting to read anthropologists who've done autoethnographic work. A lot of people have done that later in life, or maybe after their first few research projects. They turn from traveling afar to kind of traveling here at home and learning about their own community and doing it in ethnography. So that's a thing that gets done. But the model for fieldwork is still more commonly to do fieldwork with a different culture. Although sometimes that different culture may be right up the street, right? So right now I'm doing a research project with Kenites Indian tribe, which has been a great project. And the work that we're doing involves folks that live in the same Kenai Peninsula area that I do, right? And so anyways, but at its core, fieldwork tends to be travel based. When you do fieldwork, it's useful to ask what do you actually do during fieldwork, especially if you're going to go into something like applied anthropology, or thinking of some of the things I read in people's responses, people that want to kind of use an anthropological perspective to do medical work, or anthropological perspective to do emergency management work, or people that want to use an anthropological perspective in psychological counseling. Um, if you're doing what we call applied anthropology, or using anthropology to do good stuff in the real world, whether you call yourself an anthropologist or not, it's very possible that you'll be doing ethnography, which has become popular now as a method not just for anthropologists, but for people in a lot of different fields. A lot of tech design firms now want people that can do ethnography, for example. But like, what is it? So we just talked about the fact that it's out there getting gut knowledge, spending time with people, but like, what do you actually do while you're out there? I'd like to use now a cool metaphor I came up with last night, which I'm patenting right now. You are noticing American copyright law in action. It's the bread, butter, and jam explanation of ethnography. I'm not actually copywriting it, partly because I think parts of this I might have cribbed from other people. But anyways, you've heard the phrase bread and butter, right? Like the core thing that you do. For ethnographers, for anthropologists, or at least for cultural anthropologists, our bread and butter are participant observation and interviews. You travel to a place, you talk to the people, that's the interviews. They may or may not be very formal. They may just be normal conversations, but with a purpose, trying to learn things. Or they may be very formal, right? And I've had both. I've had times where an interview is sitting down with somebody and literally having like pieces of paper that they sort so I can figure out conceptual domains and like I'm being a nerd and stuff. And I've had interviews where we're just like chatting on the side of a road. But interviews, that's our butter, and our bread is participant observation, participating and observing what's going on around you. And then I put as jam, right? You can have a piece of buttered toast and that's enough, but sometimes people like to add some jam, and sometimes people like to add other methods. So for example, in the reading that you did by Gabrielle Lukens, she talks about using basically PGIS, Participatory Geographic Information System, or basically having people map out things that they knew about the landscape she was studying so that she could better understand how tourists were using that land. Sometimes we do things like discourse analysis, like record a bunch of speeches that people are giving in the community and then analyze them for the patterns of how they tell stories. Sometimes we do things like formal surveys. You can get real fancy with this stuff, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it sometime. Time diaries, where you have people record every single thing they did in a day so you better understand what their daily life is like. Domain analysis, where you do things like pile sorts, have them sort terms so you can understand how they cognitively map the world. Um, there's a lot of fancy crap we can do, and some of it's actually quite useful. But generally speaking, our bread and our butter is still participant observation and interviews. Nowadays, in the age of Zoom, traveling to a place is becoming less necessary to do the butter part of the equation, the interviews, or even some of that jam. But the bread, true participant observation, it's pretty hard to replace travel for that, at least a little bit. I think gone are the days where we necessarily always have to do years of fieldwork in a site. And I think on a practical level, sometimes all we get is a couple of weeks, right? You're working for a government agency. They want you to go and figure out some things about a situation. You maybe have a couple of weeks to go spend time there. The wonderful thing about things like Zoom and telephones is that hopefully you can make good connections during those couple weeks, then call people afterwards to do more interviews and help you understand it better. So fieldwork can be short or it can be long, and there's advantages to both. But again, bread and butter, interviews, observations. By the way, when I was first starting to be trained in anthropology, I was very, very stressed because I had to do a fieldwork project to graduate. I don't think they do that here, but where I was going to school, you did. And I was stressed because I didn't have any money and I didn't really feel like I had that much time either. So how the crap was I going to go do fieldwork? I figured out a way to do fieldwork that was much less expensive. And also ended up being a much, much better project than the ones I was looking at across the world, which was the beginning of my Navajo project, which was changed my life. But my point is, sometimes you'll be called on in applied anthropology, whether you're working for Park Service or Weather Service, or a tech design firm, to do anthropology without field work. And the question is, if I've just made the case that field work and travel is core to what we do as a discipline, does that mean if you can't do travel for a specific project that you're not doing anthropology? And I would say no. Part of what anthropology is that act of traveling and being in the field, but part of what it is drawing on what other people have said about their experiences, and part of it is just having a systematic anthropological sort of approach to questions. So you don't always have to travel to be there, and it really depends on the project and what you're trying to find out. I do think, though, that when projects do spend the time and money to send their people out to actually spend time in a community, it almost always makes the findings better. There's stuff that people don't even think about to put in a survey or an interview when you call them up that will become obvious when you're actually at a site. The value of travel is pretty hard to replace. So when possible, good to do it. Um, of course, in an online age, a certain amount of fieldwork happens in online spaces. One of my early projects, this was back in like 2013. I had already done fieldwork there. I was going to go do more fieldwork later, but I kind of had a couple year lull where I didn't have any money and I was just kind of sitting at home. So I ended up spending a whole lot of time on Facebook back when people were actually on Facebook, looking at how activists, like their press releases, their flyers, their memes, like all the different things they were doing online to communicate with each other and communicate with the public, for that Sacred Mountain project. And so online fieldwork can also be a really powerful thing. Um, I don't think it fully replaces on the ground fieldwork at all, because you miss a lot of the social dynamics that happen when people aren't in front of a computer, but it certainly has a useful role to play. All right, some basic conclusions though. Anthropology is and always has been deeply rooted in travel. Travel near, travel far, but traveling. Our curiosity started in travel, going back millennia. It accelerated as people started to travel wider during the ages of colonialism. Not that colonialism's gone, but the age of early colonialism. For better or worse, early explorers' travel from of a European bent helped inspire many early social scientists. Um, and oftentimes the earliest field workers traveled to places that were being colonized, which is deeply problematic, but part of the history of how the discipline developed as it did. And we recognize today that traveling to a place, although not always possible, tends to make fieldwork and research in general much more honest to what people are actually experiencing, partly because it changes us irrevocably as we encounter human difference out there in the real world. And that is a little bit about um, the rise of fieldwork and travel as a key part of what we do in anthropology. Thank you very much. This has been Adam Dunstan. I don't know, I just felt like there should be a fancy ending.